Welcome back to the Nikki Clarke Radio Show. The show is about conversations that matter, and we invite people from all walks of life to come and share their heart stories, their stories of upliftment and transformation. And we're always excited to meet wonderful people making great changes in the world. And we have yet another stellar individual with us today. Dr. Onye Nnorom is a family doctor and a public health and preventative medicine specialist. She's the Associate Program Director of the Public Health and Preventative Medicine Residency Program at the University of Toronto and is the Black Health Theme Lead for the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto. As a Black Health Theme Lead, she is tasked with developing educational content for teaching medical students about Black Canadian health and inequities due to systemic racism. She is also a clinical consultant for the Nicotine Dependence Clinic at the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. Dr. Onye, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Thank you for your time. Wonderful. Thank you very much. And what a wonderful day this is, isn't it? I have to say. I'm enjoying the nice weather.
Yes, finally some nice weather here in Toronto, so definitely grateful for that.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Onye, I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about your background leading up to what you're doing today.
Yes, so as you mentioned in my bio, I'm a family doctor and a public health and preventive medicine specialist. So really what that means is I'm really interested in communities and what makes communities well and makes communities unwell compared to others. And a lot of my work, whether in teaching or advocacy or research, is really around how racism impacts health and making also the steps towards creating change. So some of my work, also I'm the president of the Black Physicians Association of Ontario. So our mandate is to increase the number of Black medical students in the province. And
Absolutely.
I also host a podcast called Race, Health, and Happiness, which is about how to thrive and survive in a racialized world. So quite a bit of my work is around that, addressing racism, health, and wellness. Largely because of experiences that I had during my childhood, which framed that, and we'll talk about passions and things I imagine later on, but that is the nature of my work.
Excellent. And what influenced you to become a family doctor and to be an advocate for the wellness of the Black community?
Yeah, so I think it was a bit of a roundabout way. So, I mean, my main work is largely in public health. So actually in Canada, we have a specialty called Public Health and Preventive Medicine, just as somebody would be like a cardiologist or an obstetrician gynecologist. It is a specialty of medicine where we focus on population health. And so I ended up choosing that really by following my passions. So growing up, so I grew up in Montreal in Quebec.
So did I. We have something in common.
So Montreal as well. Yes, I grew up for most of my life actually in Montreal. And I come from a mixed ethnicity background, so same race, Black, but mixed ethnicity. So my father is from Nigeria and my mom is from Trinidad. But being in Montreal as English speakers, they were always involved in, Black community events and Black community issues. So I'd always been, involved in that work, and they would volunteer, but they didn't call it that. So that was part of my life, like community work. But then as a child, we moved. So you're from Montreal, you'll know. I grew up in a part called NDG, which is more urban part of Montreal. And then moved into the suburbs, so it's near Longueuil, Saint-Hubert. So that is a part of Montreal that is suburban, and more of a white Canadian, French white Canadian neighborhood. And so I experienced a great deal of racism. And I think this is the piece that created my passion that led to where I am in medicine now, was that my parents, particularly my mother, really was my advocate, like where kids would say they didn't want to play with me because I was Black. She would tell me about like Black history and about who I am, where I had teachers in grade 2. I had a teacher, very lovely lady, who made assumptions about my intellect. And I think if I didn't have the support system that I had, that could have actually ended up being a very different outcome. But nonetheless, she was an advocate. And so what I learned to do was to read about racism. Like I was like 10 years old and I'm, giving show and tell about the African National Congress flag that I had colored in crayon and, anti-apartheid. So at a very young age, I had an interest in community work, seeing my parents, and also anti-racism work, because that's what helped me cope. So fast forward through time, I, enjoyed the sciences. I enjoyed biology, all of that, but I didn't think about medicine because, if you don't see it, you don't think you can do it, right? There were, to be fair, Nigerian Black physicians in the community, but they were, I came from a working class family. Like those were people who sit very far off at Nigerian events at the high table, like nothing to do with my reality. But I was fortunate to be brought into a mentorship program. And so it was for Black and immigrant youth. So all of those things, like being mentored and then getting into medicine, seeing community work, and then experiencing racism, then as kind of I'll just fast forward, but my trajectory through my medical training, that remained core to my passion. And so once I realized that racism, systemic racism in particular, like our policies, our laws, our institutional practices, intentional or unintentional ways that we treat people impact their health, then it was a perfect fit, because then I was in, like I said, public health and preventive medicine, looking at different communities and understanding upstream factors like the everyday barriers that we experience as racialized people and how that impacts our health, and bringing awareness to that and teaching about that. So it really was being that like 6-year-old kid who moved from an urban environment that was very diverse into a very white French-Canadian neighborhood. That is what shaped and formed the advocacy work that then later ended up being my actual work today in medicine.
Excellent. Well, as you're describing your experience, I'm hearing a lot of parallels in my childhood as well. And it's really important because my father always taught me that in order to withstand the storms of life, you really have to have strong roots. And those roots come from having a strong identity of who you are. So very similar to what your parents did, my parents poured a lot into my soul about what was going on in the Black community. I was learning about Angela Davis and Marcus Garvey and all the wonderful heroes, that has helped shape the Black diaspora over the years. So I can totally understand what you're saying and acknowledge that piece of how it's really helped you propel your advocacy of the Black community. Completely can identify.
Yes, and I think that's important. Like for listeners who are parents, I think one of the things that is harmful that sometimes parents do with the best of intentions, like I'm a parent too, right? So with the best of intentions is tell kids to ignore, experiences of racism. But there is actually fairly good evidence, like in the literature, in the scientific literature, that for people who are, if you're part of a non-dominant group, so it doesn't necessarily mean like if just, the Black community, but you have to be grounded, as you said, in those roots, right, of like really seeing representation, understanding your history, not having just a whole experience of being othered, but grounding yourself in an identity while still being part of the mainstream. So understanding the mainstream, not completely excluding yourself either. That has been shown to have the best outcomes for social outcomes, but also outcomes around well-being for children who are in particularly racialized, right? But for other non-dominant groups too. So, gratitude to my parents and gratitude to yours. It's so important to empower children and let them understand what's going on. Les Brown, he's a motivational speaker, and he was talking about stereotyping and not internalizing it. And I love this quote. He says, when it comes to these stereotypes, don't deny it, defy it. which really means you have to understand these systems and what is being labeled at you, the barriers being brought to you. Of course, you distill it out in an age-appropriate way, but you have to understand what's going on so that you can defy it, you can actually rise above it, and hopefully help others to do the same and create change. But I think being in denial about it does not help. And actually a lot of the research around health and people who just kind of try to avoid all of the issues around racism or be in denial about it, their blood pressure is higher. They're, what's called allostatic load. There's evidence that it's not a healthy way of coping. So we've got to be able to deal with it and then find ways and tools to overcome it.
Absolutely. It's so, as you said, it's healthy to talk about these things and to not internalize them because of the detrimental effect to mental health. And speaking to that, I mean, I am of Jamaican heritage. I was born in Kingston, Jamaica, spent half of my life in Montreal growing up and then the other half here in Ontario. But one of the things that I heard growing up was don't chat your business. So when it comes to health matters, I was told very early not to talk about any of that stuff. So we have many West Indians who are suffering in silence because of this idea that there's a shame in asking for help and also talking about what they're going through, whether it be high blood pressure, diabetes, sickle cell, or even depression. They are made to believe that there's a stigma in chatting your business. What have you discovered through your findings as a doctor where that's concerned, mental health and the Black community here in Toronto?
So it's interesting. So when it comes to mental health, it's quite multi-layered because it actually also depends. Here in Toronto, that we have a very diverse Black community of people coming from East Africa, West Africa, largely the Caribbean, and then people who have been here for many generations and experienced the intergenerational trauma of racism, displacement, and that kind of thing. So the experiences vary, but I could say some common themes I would say kind of fall under like 1 to 2 areas. So one is what you just described, the stigma, right, around mental health. And this is not unique to just the Black communities. This is quite common in a number of different communities. And even in Western culture used to be quite a stigmatizing topic until more recently. So I think finding ways to be able to talk about these issues is key. A lot of people who are advocates in the Black community, and in fact in Toronto, we had our first Black Mental Health Day, which is the first Monday of the month of March, so right after Black History Month, Black Mental Health Day, and not to kind of create more stigma for the community, but to actually bring these issues to light, to say within the community we need to start talking about these issues because that creates more empowerment for us and allows people to heal, right? You can't just hold it all inside. But the second and third layer is around being able to access services. So the second layer would be being able, once you start talking about it, then you need to access services that are culturally appropriate, right? And again, I mentioned like the diversity within our communities, but also that standard Western medicine might not always be people's way of healing. And I'm not talking about like, I can't speak to like herbal medicine. That's outside of my scope. But certainly there are ways that are complementary to Western medicine, like healing circles, where it's just a different way of speaking in a very more Pan-African way that is more comfortable to people. And also could be healing, right? Like in and of its own right? And have an impact. And then there are things like in Toronto, we've got the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health where I work, and there's ways where researchers have looked at modifying talk therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy, and doing what's called a cultural adaptation. So that's available here too, where they've taken something Western and then made it more appropriate for a Caribbean community. But so once you start talking about it, you do, like as a society, we do need to have resources available that are appropriate. But then the top layer is really understanding what drives a lot of these mental health issues within certain communities. And so systemic racism does play a key part of that for us. Being denied opportunities, being, we say in our community, last to be hired, first to be fired, right? So socioeconomic instability or living basically in poverty, all of these factors will drive mental health stressors for people. And so there has to be a recognition in our community, not that we're not taking responsibility for ourselves, but understanding that if any group had been through what we have been through, whether it's the colonization, the slavery, and then present day stereotyping and targeting by police and targeting in the schools, my goodness, what community would be able to come through that without having some stress that leads to mental health issues, right? So there has to be a recognition that we need to talk about it because that just happens. It's part of life. We need to be able to access appropriate resources, but we also need to call upon the greater society that, we didn't oppress ourselves. And so the greater society has a role to play in undoing some of the structures that have created the pressures for which some people are experiencing mental health stressors.
Absolutely.
So I would say those are the three layers. We need to be able, and so that's what the Black Mental Health Day was really about. It was highlighting those, and it really came from community through community, but a wake-up call for society at large.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And it's a great observation to make of the many layers there are to one issue. It's not just a one fix all for something that's happening. There are many layers to it, and as I experienced when I was campaigning for the federal election this past October, actually, there were many things that I was faced with, and actually before October came, it was September. I was actually in the area where there was the eruption of violence, gun violence in Malton. And that is, the gun violence is one part of many different layers of issues. So I can completely identify with what you're saying. So Dr. Onye, I really appreciate the pearls of wisdom that you shared with us today. But what can you share with us about how your life has been transformed by pursuing these passion projects of yours?
Yes, I think for me, I'm just filled with gratitude. As I mentioned, I came from a working class family. My parents had different odd jobs, but much of the time they worked as maintenance people. And so I'm very grateful for all of the different people who have come into my life, both who look like me racially and who do not look like me, who were able to reach out a hand and see my potential and encourage me. And so for me, that is one of the things that I really try to do, because I have been so blessed to have that. I grew up, like I mentioned, I started off in a low-income neighborhood, and I knew kids who were much smarter than I am, or who were, much smarter than I was at the time. But because of a number of different challenges that they experienced in their lives, particularly the Black boys, seeing, there's statistics showing in Montreal, census data looking at 1996 to 2006, a Black person with a graduate degree had the same unemployment rate as a non-Black high school dropout in Montreal. Right? That was the context in which I was growing up. And although at the time I didn't have the statistic, that paper was published by McGill, just I think in 2009 or something like that. But growing up in it, we saw it. We saw parents with, higher education that they achieved in Canada and not getting that, Canadian or American dream of upward mobility. And so, having seen that, I feel very fortunate. And so what has transformed me is really seeing that I can enter a chorus of voices and also amplify voices with the research that I do, with the people that I work with. For years, I worked at TAIBU Community Health Centre, which is a health center for that has a mandate to serve the Black community in the Greater Toronto Area. There have been so many experiences where I have both had the benefit to contribute as a physician, but also learn from community and be supported by community, that it is such a beautiful thing. And so I think that the thing about following one's passion is it's not always easy, and you have these moments where you're like, should I be doing this? I had, people in the field, particularly in public health, who hadn't seen that before, right? Like, I really am carving out my own niche, who, really thought that I was being unrealistic, or maybe I should just, do X or Y type of work that is more conventional. And so it wasn't easy. And sometimes I ask myself questions like, should I be doing this? Does anybody care? Can I contribute something? And I'm so grateful that I am able to do that. Like I said, I teach at the University of Toronto in the medical school. Based on the work that we've done with them, with the Black Physicians Association, we had one Black medical student in the class, in the first year class 4 years ago. Now for the last 2 years, based on, a lot of work that has been done collaboratively with the University of Toronto, there were 15 Black medical students in last year's class, 15 Black medical students in the most recent first year class, and just more students being aware of oppression and wanting to do more and wanting to provide culturally safe care. So I'm seeing change happen, working in collaboration with so many people. The podcast that I mentioned, Race, Health, and Happiness, just so blessed to be able to interview people and talk about racism and both individual ways of overcoming, but the community ways that we have done for, centuries to be able to gather and overcome, and talk about that and share that with youth and have the youth feel empowered so that they are going on to do greater things. So it really does make me feel like my life has meaning. It makes me feel like I can encourage, so I have a 4-year-old and a 2.5-year-old, that I can instill that in them to say, like, you can make a difference and follow your gifts. So I'm, always monitoring their gifts and how I can help them with that. So I think in so many ways in my own life, being able to find purpose and meaning has really enriched my life. It's not always easy. I'm not going to play, but it's really enriched my life and keeps me going.
Sure.
And even in this, COVID-19 context, I'm able to still see my North Star and have purpose and have meaning, so I can see beyond the stress going on now. And that's something that I also tell my students or people that I'm working with. It's, it's really important to be able to see beyond the present moment, but the long term. So I feel blessed in I know that was a long answer, but I feel blessed in all of those different ways, right?
Oh, wonderful. And it's inspiring to hear how you've taken so much of your experiences and have overcome in such a rewarding and enriching way, and you're able to bless so many people with these values that you've learned along your journey. So thank you very much for that. So Dr. Onye, I really appreciate the time that you've taken with us to talk a little bit about what you do, and I know there are people who would love to reach out to you. How can they find you on social media?
Yes, so my Twitter handle is Onye Active MD, so ONYE and then Active MD, like medical doctor. As I mentioned, I have the podcast, so for that I'm on multiple social media platforms, but if you go to racehealthhappy.com or racehealthhappiness.com, you can find it. Otherwise, you could just Instagram, Twitter, it's at racehealthhappy. So those are the ways to reach me, and I look forward to hearing from anyone who either appreciated the show or wants to share wisdom. I'm learning all the time where I mention something and then people say, oh, have you heard of this or have you thought of that? So I love it, and thank you very much, Nikki, for this opportunity.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your knowledge. You've been listening to the Nikki Clarke Radio Show with our very special guest, Dr. Onye Nnorom, and I really wish you all the best. Keep rising and continue to keep uplifting the community. So thank you again. Stay safe, stay strong, and talk to you soon.
Thank you. Same to you.
You're welcome. Bye for now.